session here at St. Thomas Episcopal Church. And if you were not here last week, be sure that you get online, go to the church's YouTube website page and take a look at last week's lesson, which kind of sets a base for what we're doing throughout these 8 weeks. It was kind of a very quick look at just parables at a general level. So we're going to do the same thing today with a look at Old Testament parables. It's going to be way too fast and way too much, but it'll set the stage for what we do for the remaining 6 weeks. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God, you astound us. You spoke creation into being and then gave us mouths to speak too. You taught us that words are powerful things, that they matter greatly, that they can bless and heal and make sense of things we can't quite understand, just as surely as they can curse and wound and even pretend truth is not truth. As we pay heed to the figures of speech in which your people once spoke, teach us what we need to know about you, about ourselves, about your kingdom. Teach us to use our words to teach others about you. Amen. Well, all right. If you were not here last week, here's a quick review of what we did. First of all, we described, it's really not so much a definition, but we described what a parable is. And if you want to know what a parable is, then you got to go look at the website. And then we talked about what parables are, as well as what they're not. And we spent really more time talking about what they're not at this particular point last week. We also looked at how many parables there are, and it depends on your definition of what a parable is, as well as where to find those parables. Obviously, most of them are then, since they're Jesus' parables, they're going to be in the Gospels. But where in the Gospels do you actually find those parables? We talked about a little bit about the variety of parables that you will run into in the New Testament, and the need for us to be able to interpret a parable, because a parable is situated at a particular time and place, and so historical context really does matter when we're talking about parables. And then finally, why are there parables? Why don't you just say what you mean? Which is a good question, but it really begs the question because we're always talking in figures of speech. We're never not talking in figures of speech, which means that for us to be able to communicate, and we kind of take this for granted, it's hidden, but it takes interpretation for you to understand anything I'm saying. Yeah, I know that's true, but it's vice versa as well. And actually, it's more complicated for us to be able to understand somebody who's speaking to us than it is to understand something in a book. Because in a book, we can just sit there and contemplate and think about it, but when we're talking, we got to do it on the fly. But yet, we think that's a whole lot easier than comprehending a book. Well, anyway, interpretation is always necessary, and parables are just, it's the way we talk. It just is. Has always been and always will be. So let's move in then to the Old Testament itself and see what Jesus knew and what Jesus used, and we'll see some echoes from, we'll see the actual statements in the Old Testament that we'll find echoes in Jesus. And I'll draw attention to some of those echoes throughout the course today, but mostly it's kind of setting the stage, as I said, for the weeks to come. So let me get started, though, by turning to Star Trek. I was kind of a Star Trek junkie. I've not watched any of the newer stuff, but I was an old Star Trek junkie when I was a kid, and when Star Trek Next Generation came out, I was already doing the same kind of work that Katie's doing now, so I didn't really have time to watch them all, but when I could, that was one of my rare exceptions of actually watching some TV. I watched the Star Trek Next Generation. Well, because it's in outer space and several centuries in the future, obviously as the Star Trek crew is running into peoples or things throughout the universe, they don't speak English necessarily. And so they have this universal translator, which does a pretty decent job of helping them somewhat communicate, but there are issues of communication that are always taking place through all the episodes. One of the early episodes in season 1, won't go into all the details, but there is a life form that the Star Trek crew comes across that it takes them a while to be, I mean, the thing translates for them, but they can't make any sense of what it's saying until finally they kept pondering this one statement that this life form kept making over and over about ugly bags of mostly water. And I've shared this with you on occasions in the past. It kept talking about ugly bags of mostly water. And at some point, the breakthrough comes when the Star Trek crew realizes it's talking about human beings. And I just thought, what a wonderful improvement on Plato's description of a human. Ugly bags of mostly water. Look at each other and you can see that's ugly bags of mostly. Then in season 5, there was the one that the whole thing really was about interpretation. There was an episode called Darmok. And even if you're not a Star Trek junkie, I would say watch this particular episode at some point. It is storytelling at its best, even though I'm a homie when it comes to Star Trek stuff. It's this episode called Darmok. There's this other life being called Darmok who is an explorer of kinds, but there's an episode, they come into contact with the Star Trek crew, and the captain of the starship and this other life being, they get sent down to a planet where there's a third being down there that is a beast that is now trying to kill them. Well, the Star Trek captain thinks the other life form's trying to kill him too, and so they're at loggerheads. But time and time again, this other life being, completely apart from the beast, which they only gradually begin to understand is there, keeps talking in language that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. He'll say things like Darmok and Galad at Tanagra. Well, okay. What is a Darmok? And none of this stuff makes any sense, and he keeps talking like this, and eventually they realize there's another beast, and they start trying to work together, only to have the other life form get knifed, and it begins to die. And at the very end of the episode, finally, the Star Trek captain realizes that the other guy is talking in metaphors, because he'll also say things like, Darmok, his arms open wide. Again, without a context, it's hard to make any sense of what that's supposed to mean. Is that good? Is it bad? What's going on? And he finally realizes that the guy's trying to become friends. And he doesn't talk straight like we think we talk. He just talks in metaphors. And when he finally realizes that, as the other guy is dying, Captain Picard begins talking in metaphors to him to ease him as he dies. And what he talks in metaphors about is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was just this wonderful, and I did a terrible job telling you about this episode, but it's all about interpretation. How do you begin to understand what somebody else is saying when you have no clue what the words mean or the context in which they're trying to use them? Again, we do that on the fly all the time as we address matters of communication and metaphorical language with each other. So let's jump in then to the Old Testament and see how this works there. So the Old Testament word that will eventually get translated into Greek as parabole, or transliterated into English as parable, is mashal. Mashal is a word that has a very broad group of things that it covers, which is kind of true of Hebrew generally, but certainly true of this particular word. It can mean a proverb, it can mean a maxim, it can mean a byword, it can mean a parable, it can mean a whole bunch of other things. And so you'll see this word translated into English by a variety of different words, and these are just some of them. And to just kind of get into this, I'm going to walk us through each of these four texts pretty quickly, just to give you a sense of how it shows up and the kinds of things it's actually referring to. So for instance, in Numbers 21, you'll come across this comment. And not a single one of you is nodding your head going, yeah, okay, I get that. Because you probably don't know the historical context. You don't know who or what or where Heshbon is, or what happened there. And unless you've really been paying attention to some of the biblical reading that you do, you don't even know who or what Sion is. Well, this in the book of Numbers occurs after they've been wandering around for quite a while, and now they're almost ready to get into Canaan. And there are these two master races, as it were, over on the east side of the Jordan. And the Hebrew people, amazingly, are able to defeat these two kings. One's name is Og, and one is Sion. And having defeated them, well, they're kind of proud about this, what they've been able to accomplish. And so in their pride, they start referring to Sion's capital city of Heshbon as something they get to rebuild, because they killed Sion and it's now their city and they can do with it as they please. And so it becomes kind of a byword or a proverb of being able to talk about a great victory that you have achieved with the help of God. So if you've got a great victory that you want to draw attention to and brag about and be arrogant about, you can say, come to Heshbon and let it be rebuilt.
Is it like a song?
It's more like a maxim, like an adage. A proverb works really well as well. Though it may be that you could sing it, you can certainly sing it as a kind of a taunt, but it's really a boast in this particular situation. Here's another. You might read that and go, I don't even hardly understand the words, much less what it's supposed to mean. But the context in this particular case, Saul has just been anointed to become king by Samuel the prophet. And as he is now leaving and getting back to his home, he happens upon a troop of prophets that are walking past him. And for whatever reason, and however, it's not told how it happens, but seeing those prophets and interacting momentarily with the prophets, Saul begins to prophesy, which causes some of the onlookers to draw attention to that and say regarding Saul, well, who's his father? And then make this comment. Is Saul also a prophet? Well, this is kind of a taunt. Who does he think he is? We've known Saul his whole life. He's never prophesied once or acted like, what's come over him? Begin to kind of understand that? I'm going to come back to this in just a little bit, but that's the context for this particular proverb. Who does Saul think he is? Or here's another one. This looks pretty straightforward. A couple of times in the book of Job, Job will talk. He will discourse. But it's actually a whole lot more complicated than that, because when you really start paying attention to what it is he's saying, he's not being duplicitous, but he's actually cold cocking the guy that he's talking to, making fun of him as being a real stupid oaf for saying the kinds of dumb things he's been saying to Job. But it's in this wise, stilted language that makes it sound wonderful. So they call it in this place a discourse, when in fact it's a biting critique. And then here's one last one, just to get us moving this morning. Jesus will actually quote this in chapter 13 of Matthew. So we'll come back to this again in a couple of weeks. I open my mouth in parables. Well, at one level, it's just saying we can't talk without using figures of speech. It's just the way we communicate with one another. But then there's this statement. Those of you who were here last week, I mentioned that unlike Aristotle, who thought that parables were based in imagination, things that were unreal or never happened, the Hebrew people based their parables, their maxims, in history itself. They drew inspiration and their figures of speech from their history with God and their history with the nations around them. Here's the psalmist saying, the parable that I'm about to tell you is based in history. It's based on our past. That's the well from which I'm going to draw the information that I'm going to share with you. Which means that for the Hebrews, communication as well as interpretation is a kind of linguistic archaeology. We're drawing from something that has become hidden and unknown, in the same way that an archaeologist digs out things that have become lost and makes them available and begins to interpret those for people. That's something you can add to your resume. You are a linguistic archaeologist. Every Sunday when you share with us from Scripture, you dig into Scripture for a while and come up with, you don't spend time then telling us about how you scraped with, what, you share the beauty of whatever it is that you've discovered. Here's the psalmist saying, this is what I'm about to do. I'm going to enlighten you by the things that I have discovered. Well, as I mentioned, that word mashal will get translated into Greek in the Septuagint Bible as what we see as parable, and we're off to the races at that point. So for the rest of the morning, I'm going to share with you 9 different kinds of mashalim that you'll run across in the Old Testament. And this will just either put you to sleep or it will excite you to no end this morning as we get ready for next week. So 9 types that we're going to look at. And the first one is what we could kind of call a brief maxim. In the NIV, they call this an old saying, or in the King James Version, or in the NRSV that many of us read, it's often referred to as an ancient proverb. Well, what is an ancient proverb? What's an old saying? Well, think Benjamin Franklin and Poor Richard's Almanac. A short, pithy statement that conveys a lot that everybody knows, Now, maybe not if you're under a certain age in American culture, but for the rest of us, since we're above that age, we all know these things. And so if I were to simply say something like, the early bird, you've already thought the rest of the brief maxim, haven't you? The early bird catches the worm. Or to use another one, early to bed, early to rise. Yeah. That's a brief maxim, a historically based old proverb or ancient piece of wisdom. So you got a sense of what it is now? Here's one of those in 1 Samuel 24. Well, you can see with the proverb, from evildoers come evil deeds, but you probably don't have any idea what's going on here. Saul has decided that David is his enemy. This is early on, long before David has become king. Saul is still king, but Saul is now murderously chasing David throughout Judah, trying to find him. And he has gotten really close a whole bunch of times. And on this particular occasion, he's right there. They're right together. David, in order to save his own hide, he and the few men that are with him, they have taken up residence in the back of a lengthy cave. Okay? Saul is just out. He's on TV, this would work really well. You see David go in there with his men, and then right at that point, Saul is coming up with his men. Well, unfortunately, when Saul arrives at the cave, he's getting to be a little bit of an older man, and he must relieve himself. He must make water. He's got to go pee. Whatever kind of statement you want to use here at this point. And he's got to empty his bladder. And so steps away from his men for just a moment because he sees a cave. And he goes in there to conduct his business, rather by himself. And while he's in there, he apparently takes a very long time to pull this off. So, I don't know, he's got prostate issues. But anyway, it takes him a while to do this, long enough. I mean, he can't see back into the cave, but the guys in the back of the cave can see that Saul has just entered it. And so David's men whisper to David and say, kill him while you got a chance. And David says, I ain't doing that. He's the king. He may be trying to kill me, but I can't kill him. But what he does do, he sneaks up, and this is what it takes Saul a little while to empty his bladder on this occasion. So David is able to sneak up and cut a piece off his robe. And then sneak away with the little piece of the robe. So then when Saul is finished, he puts back on his robe and marches out, humming a tune. He's happy now, and gets up with his men and gets a little ways away, and David comes out of the cave and yells at him some things, including this. Look at your robe. I had a chance, but I didn't. From evildoers come evil deeds. You think I'm a murderous person trying to kill you, Saul. I'm not. So the New Testament version of this proverb is, you can know a tree by its fruit. Or, in the other version of it, a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree bears good fruit. If I were as you thought I am, you'd be a dead man right now. But I'm not. Get a grip, King Saul. You see that? Here's another one. That's not what I wanted to do. From Ezekiel, chapter 12. Again, this is a kind of brief maxim. Everything goes on the same as ever. All the prophetic warnings are false alarms. And you might say, well, that's not such a short one. But in the NIV it says, days go by and every vision comes to nothing. Days go by and every vision comes to nothing. Well, the context for this particular statement, of course, Israel's long gone by this point. Judah is almost at the point where Babylon's ready to put an end to them. And so Ezekiel and other prophets have been warning the Judahites over and over and over again that if you don't stop doing what you're doing, exile is the only answer. It's going to happen. Well, the prophet says it, and nothing happens. The prophet says it again, and nothing happens. The prophet says it again and again and again, and nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens. Everything just goes on the same as ever. Nothing ever changes. You're wasting your breath, prophet. You're just spouting. You're not being truthful or accurate about anything that you're saying. Words, just words, with no meaning behind them is another way to say this. Or some of the kinds of proverbs that we use today to illustrate this same idea is, remember Chicken Little? The sky's falling, the sky's falling. Everything just goes on the same as ever, even though you keep clamoring and saying that. Or wolf, wolf. And there is no wolf. You say it enough times, people quit paying you any attention for good reasons. Promises, promises. Or, to become a little cynical, yeah, whatever. Or, yeah, we've heard this one before. Or, it's time to quit talking and start doing. Or, why don't you put your money where your mouth is? Those are all ways we say the same thing as what we find here in this particular statement. Or, the New Testament version is when the Pharisees in chapter 12 of Matthew, this is after Jesus has now been teaching for quite a while, and he's getting a rather large following, but the Pharisees aren't buying it, and so they finally tell Jesus, show us a sign. We've heard enough words, do something. Quit promising, act. Show us a sign. And Jesus refuses to get baited into that. Or I saw this one online a couple of weeks ago. This is just a made-up thing, but it has a point to it. Here's the statement. It's in the form of a logical proof. Jesus promised to eliminate evil people. Thor promised to eliminate frost giants. There are no frost giants. Jesus obviously can't do what he says he does, because they're still evil people. But there aren't any frost giants, so it must be Thor who's the real God. Jesus promised to eliminate evil people. Well, actually, I don't think he ever did, but according to this statement, Jesus promised to eliminate evil people. Thor promised to eliminate frost giants. There are no frost giants. Draw your own conclusion. Everything goes on the same. Here's another kind, a metaphor. A metaphor is more of a popular kind of proverb. It's very similar to the first one, but it's a kind of saying that could be a little lengthier than what a brief maximum might be. And so here, let's return to that that time when Saul begins to prophesy. This gives you a little bit more of the context here. Now, the positive way to interpret this statement is this, and I'll use a personal example. When I was ordained, as is true for, I guess, anybody that is ordained, there is a laying on of hands that takes place. You may kneel, you may prostrate yourself, you may do a lot of different things, but there is a laying on of hands that takes place from the bishop, where authority is passed on and from that person and taken by the one who's about to be ordained. That laying on of hands provides something of the transfer there. Well, that just seems kind of magical to me. that I can touch you and something comes out of me and now you have it. But I'm here to tell you that when those hands got laid on me, I got zapped. Now, it's not that, I shook and my tongue flopped out of my mouth and I laid there. Nothing in that sense. But there was still, I knew something occurred. Well, the same sort of thing happens, doesn't it, when we get married? Beyond thinking, well, I've done it now. There's one thing. Yeah, there's no going back. That's right. I mean, there's one thing to live together, but there's a lack of commitment, isn't there? You can just walk away. Many do. And I realize people walk away from marriages too, but those vows, the oaths, the laying on of hands, there's something different about being married than just living together. I mean, anything that you do married, you can do living together, but it takes a different form. The meaning is different. When I got hands laid on me, the acts of teaching and preaching became different. And there was a power there that wasn't before. Saul gets anointed, and suddenly he's able to do some things he'd never previously done. And people who looked at him, who'd known him in the past, wondered, what? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? How are you doing this? Not knowing necessarily all of the context. Robert Browning's poem kind of makes the same idea here. But a man's reach should exceed his grasp. Or what's a heaven for? Saul's kind of reaching beyond what he'd always been capable of. Or here's a negative version of it that we find in the New Testament. Where again, the people who've known Jesus wonder what's gotten into his britches. What are you up to? What makes you think you can do all these things and say all these things? We know where you came from. You're not pulling the wool over us. See all these figures of speech that we know, take for granted? We know you. This is not who you've been. And here's some of the ways that we say this same parable today. You used to work with me. We had cubicles right next to each other. You didn't know you were biblical when you were using these statements with other people, did you? Well, here's another kind of Old Testament parable as metaphor that we find in Ezekiel 18. This one you've probably heard before. You know this one. Parents eat sour grapes and children's teeth are set on edge. Judah has not yet gone into exile, but they are right on the cusp already. And the folks that are about to go into exile aren't happy about it. They are, in fact, pouting at this particular, it's a kind of childlike self-pity that they're engaging in. You're holding us responsible for what our parents did, God. That's not fair. It's our parents who did this, not us. We're innocent. Okay, whatever. But we're the ones paying the price for what those who preceded us did. So they're unwilling to take responsibility for themselves. They're casting blame then on somebody else. Here's the responsible party. Not me. My parents. My parents did this to me. Well, okay, it's one thing to point and say, he's to blame, not me. I mean, that gets all the way back to Adam and Eve, doesn't it? But we continue to engage in that today. Far more important and sinister is that it becomes an excuse for not doing something ourselves. It's one thing to say my parents are really the responsible ones. It's another to say, therefore, I don't have to do this. Well, your parents may be to blame, but that doesn't relieve you of responsibility. You still need to get a job and pay your bills. So do it. Well, here's some of the forms that this takes both in the New Testament as well as our version today. But I guess what we need to know is that God rejects their little pity party. I was having fun with that pity party, the alliterativeness of it. It's a petty, pouty pity party that they engage in. I can't add the A part because then it would be petty, pity, pouty party. Can't go to patty, so we'll just stick with the others. So here's the New Testament version. It takes place in John chapter 5. Jesus finds an invalid man, who's been for 38 years lying beside this pool, and Jesus walks by and says, "Why are you lying here?" And the guy says, "Well, I don't have anybody to help me into the pool. It's not my fault I'm lying here. It's their fault. They're not helping me." Same general idea. Or to step on some people's feet for just a moment. So let me do this, and just don't hate me too much as a result of it. But a couple of the versions that take place all the time, contemporaneously, you have white folks telling black folks, "Why are you blaming me? I didn't enslave you." Well, it's one thing to make the claim. It's another to refuse to address the present iniquities or inequities that are out there. Both of those need to be addressed, but you get nowhere by just saying, "Well, I didn't live back then. I didn't enslave you." I mean, I can add, my family wasn't even in America in the 1860s. But it doesn't relieve me of the responsibilities of addressing things today. Now, I'm not saying that the way to address it is to have monetary payoffs or whatever. That's a whole complicated issue. But we've got to recognize there are still matters of racism in our culture, and there are effects that occur, et cetera, et cetera. And we get nowhere by just saying, "Well, I didn't do it. She did it." Or another one, to now reverse it, We hear folks from the projects all the time saying things like, well, how do you expect me to get out of the ghetto? If you lived here, you'd be stuck just like me. It's somebody else's fault, not mine. There's a refusal to take responsibility that you can begin to educate yourself. It may be tough, but you can do it. Whole lots of other folks have done it across the years, but there's that childlike refusal to take responsibility for yourself. Somebody else ate the sour grapes, not me. I'm just having to pay the price. Okay. Have your pity party if that's what you want, but it ain't going to get us anywhere. Got to move beyond that. So here's another one. A proverb as a kind of derisive song. It's almost, in fact, I really think you could call it a taunt. It's the sort of playground taunt that we engaged in at one point in time, and obviously don't do it any longer at our age. But it can also be a pronunciation of woe on a situation. So here's a version of this that occurs in the Old Testament. God, through the prophet, is telling the Hebrew people that exile will eventually come to an end. I will step in and get you back out of exile. And when that time comes, here's what you will begin to say. Here's the taunt. How the oppressor has come to an end. How his fury has ended. Well, it's a prophecy against Babylon. Babylon, as great as it is, cannot stand forever. Well, there's a New Testament version of this very statement. It takes place in the book of Revelation in chapter 19. And again, it's regarding Babylon, in which it is said, come to the birds, come and to the great supper of the Lord, and eat the flesh of the fallen kings. Babylon will fall, and you will emerge victorious, triumphant over them. Come like birds to the great supper feast and eat the flesh of the kings. Our version is just much more simple. Nana, nana, boo, boo. I win, you lose, but same idea. Or here's one from the prophet Habakkuk. In chapter 2, there are 5 woes that are pronounced against Babylon. And here's the first of them. You thought you were so high and mighty, dragging us away, making us exiles away from our land. But you finally got your comeuppance. You aren't as big as you thought you were. And that shows up in the New Testament as well. It shows up in Luke chapter 1. In that beautiful statement that we read every Advent, that we know as Mary's Magnificat. Right in the midst of it, she talks about God taking the mighty down a notch or two and lifting up the lowly. Well, that's not just a pretty, beautiful comment. That's an in-your-face, I win and you lose kind of comment. God helps me do this, and it ain't always going to be this way. And you're not always going to emerge victorious. I will. Just watch. You know, Mary was a little spunky brat. Or here's another one. Another prophet, Micah. The prophets have been telling the people over and over and over again, look, you've got to live fairly with each other. You can't have billionaires and people living in poverty. You got to share. It's not, there's something inappropriate about gathering everything up just to yourself. There's going to come a time when God is going to step in and equity is going to occur. And when that time happens, you, the mighty, are going to start pouting and saying, this happened to us. It's not fair. We are utterly ruined. It's a taunt of ridicule. That actually, the people who finally begin to get something are putting into the mouths of the people who were the rich ones before. Well, here's yet another one, a byword. That often takes the form of mocking scorn. A byword is a word. It often can be a person's name or even a place name that, because of the historical context, conveys all kinds of information that you don't have to go into. You just have to say that one word, and everybody goes, like Hiroshima. They have to say a whole lot more. Or Gettysburg. Or Vicksburg, or a whole bunch of others. Or Milvian Bridge. And you all look at me like, huh? The context matters, but if you know the context, you have a byword. It conveys lots of information. So here's an example. Doesn't use the byword, but it says you are going to become a byword. This is back before the Hebrew people are even in Canaan. Moses is winding up his speeches to the Hebrew people, telling them what they need to do and what they need to not do when they actually cross the Jordan and enter the land of Canaan and begin to live. That if they don't do what he's now sharing with them, that God has told him that they are to do or not do, that they're going to lose Canaan. And when that happens, you are going to become a byword. All anybody's going to have to do is just say, the Hebrew people. And everybody's going to smile and go, yeah, we know. We know what that means. When you go into exile, the victors are going to be able to taunt you and make fun of you and do to you whatever they please. Psalm 22 is another version of this. The person who is speaking in Psalm 22 is saying, he's doing some things he needs to do, wants to do, trying to serve God, and he says, down around verse 7 or so, all who see me mock me. They say things like, he trusts in God, let God save him. Because it's not going to happen, right? Well, here's the New Testament version of that. The very same words get quoted by the Pharisees regarding Jesus on the cross. You've become a byword. It ain't going to happen. Here's yet another version. Here's yet another version. These are all the way through the Old Testament, incidentally. Or even a longer one. Solomon says, God, if you don't remain holy, if you don't continue doing what I've said to you now that you've built the temple, you're going to go into exile. Your descendants are going to go into exile, and the very temple itself is going to become a byword. And sure enough, when you read a little bit later in Psalms, say in the 130s in the Psalms, where the Babylonians are saying to the Hebrew people, sing us a song of Zion. Well, they're just making fun of them. They don't have any basis for singing their songs anymore. And so they can just make fun of them saying, dance a jig for us. We can tell you what to do. The prophetic oracle is the kind that takes place in the book of Numbers. Balaam is the gentleman that is hired by Balak to pronounce curses upon the Hebrew people just before they cross the Jordan River. But every time he opens his mouth, instead of a curse coming out, a blessing comes out instead. And so Balak keeps trying to get him to curse the Hebrew people, and every time he does it, the blessings just become more profound over and over and over again, until finally Balak just goes home and throws in the towel and says it isn't going to work. Or a discourse. We saw this earlier with Job. This time I've added a few of the words that he speaks to Bildad the Shuhite. And you can begin to see what he's really saying to him. It's a taunting, mocking, critical statement that he makes to him. Still another form is a riddle. There's one riddle in the Old Testament that you probably know. It's one we looked at about 1.5 years ago. It's from the book of Judges. Samson has, on his way to getting married, he has killed a lion, and then he's come back later and seen that it's full of honey. And so he asks a riddle of all of the men who are going to be in the wedding along with him. And when he tells the riddle to them, out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. Well, they have no idea how to answer that particular riddle because they don't know what he did. They don't know that he killed a lion. They don't know that bees created some honey inside of that lion. And so they're never able to answer the riddle. But that's the riddle right there that he uses. One of the other places that the word for riddle occurs in the Old Testament is in 1 Kings, when the Queen of Sheba comes to pay a visit to Solomon. It says that she asked him all kinds of hard questions. Well, that word is riddles. She asked him all kinds of riddles. She came and showed up and she tried to stump him with all these things that she was asking him. But amazingly, Solomon was wise enough that no matter how tough the riddles she asked, he was able to answer them repeatedly, which just showed everybody how wise he really was. When you move beyond the Old Testament into the Apocrypha, here's a statement that actually uses that same word. Well, here's yet another one. There are riddles that show up in the New Testament too. Again, if you move to the book of Revelation, if you're reading through chapter 13, among certain groups of Christians, when you get to the end of chapter 13, you're scared out of your senses when you read that the number of the beast is 666. It is a riddle that needs to be solved, the answer to which is not immediately apparent. Or there's another version that occurs in the New Testament. Right in the last week of Jesus' life, he's having arguments with the Pharisees. fairly regularly. And there comes a point in time when he asks the Pharisees, he actually quotes Psalm 110, first verse in Psalm 110, where David says to his Lord, and he calls him my Lord. And David says, well, who's the Messiah? He asks the Pharisees, and when the Pharisees say David's son, then he wants to know, well, if he's David's son, how can he call him Lord? You don't call your son the Lord. You are the Lord over your son, not the other way around. And so he creates this riddle that they're unable to answer at that particular point. Well, we use these sorts of religious riddles all the time today. Folks who are rather skeptical will say things like, well, how can God if God can do everything, can God make a square circle? Or how can God be 3 in 1 at the same time? Or, well, how can evil exist in a world that God created good? Or how can Jesus be born of a virgin? There are all these riddles that we ask to try to make a statement that something is wrong here. Yet another is a fable. A fable differs from a parable in that a parable is often built around people. A fable is built around animals or trees, vegetables, rocks, those sorts of things. So Aesop's fables always have animals in them. Jesus' parables always have people in them. We're about out of time, so I can't do much about the fables, but here's one of the fables that you run into in the Old Testament. If you take a look at that passage, you'll see the fable as it plays itself out. Or yet another one is in 2 Kings chapter 14. Jehoash says this to Amaziah. Amaziah is a young guy who has just defeated the Edomites, and he proposes a connection with Jehoash, and Jehoash basically says, I, in all of my regal goodness, am not about to deal with a spindly little upstart like you, and makes fun of you. You are a thistle. I am a mighty cedar. And the final kind is an allegorical parable. You know this one from this particular story. David has just had Uriah killed so that he can wed Bathsheba. Nathan the prophet comes up and engages in this allegory about a rich man who takes a poor man's lamb. And when David gets upset and says he should die, Nathan says, you are the man. Or yet another one is this one, in Ezekiel 17. It's a much more complicated and convoluted one. Or yet another one that will actually show up in the New Testament as well. Jesus will take this very story and transform it into his parable of the tenants that we'll come across in a few weeks. Well, that's quickly 9 different kinds of mashalim. We could keep right on going with a whole bunch more, but you've about had it already. So next week we'll get to the fun stuff. We'll start talking about parables that Jesus told and try our best to kind of get into them and pull out some new ways of thinking about these parables that maybe you've not thought about before. Some new ways to consider Jesus' parables. And we'll start with his parables about the kingdom, those parables that he told early on in his ministry prior to the feeding of the 5,000, prior to the transfiguration. So we'll see you next week as we jump into the actual New Testament part.